All right, so I think I have everything set up okay here. So I'm going to hopefully kind of document some of the stuff I've been messing around with Reclaim Cloud here over the last 24, 40 hours, learning a lot of little stuff about Docker and things like that. I am a little feeling I was hoping to tell like a coherent through line story here of like this is what I wanted to do, this is what I learned, this is how it ended up working out for me. But I will say I am not a notes person. I'm kind of a it needs to live in my head sort of person in terms of how ideas work. So and I was dealing with some technical things with OBS right before I hit live here. I had messed up my bit rate in OBS. I've been doing some testing with how much upload bandwidth I could expect my connection to have, and I accidentally put an extra zero at the end of that number, so OBS was trying to send not a 20 megabit stream to this, it was sending a 200 megabit stream, and I don't have internet that can do anything like that, so that wasn't working. Anyway, had to hunt a whole bunch of streaming stuff down, but I've got that now. So I'm gonna kind of show what I was trying to do here. So, um, what the first of all, I'll kind of lead off with sort of what application I wanted to get running. So this is a tool called Foundry. It's a virtual tabletop tool. You use it for playing role-playing games like D&D or what's the other big one? I mean, there's tons of them, but I can't think of the Pathfinder is the other really popular one. Use that for playing D&D with like friends over the internet. So um, I've got a group of folks I've been playing D&D with for a couple years now, which is that's insane. But yeah, it's been since my daughter's been born, basically. And we will hop on a Discord for a couple hours once a week, play D&D, and we use a virtual tabletop tool like this to have our characters represented on screen and do things like that. I don't know if I'm going to have time to actually show much about what the actual tool works like, but if you've done anything like this, you might be familiar with Roll20, really popular tool. Roll20 is a product, and it's a really nice product, but this is sort of a self-hosted, it's not open source actually, but it's a self-hostable thing like that. It is a paid product actually. So I bought a license for it. I think it was like 30 or 50 bucks one time. And it's an amazing tool. Plus there's a huge community of people building plugins and modules for it. So it's awesome. Anyway, I wanted to get this running in Reclaim Cloud. We've used Foundry in my group, hosted on folks' actual computers. So basically, like the dungeon master would load it up on their computer, and then they have to do like port forwarding. And if their upload speed is bad, the tool doesn't work so well. And we've been doing this for years, so I was like, I have the expertise to like host this right. So I wanted to do that, and along the way, learn some things about Docker. So the first thing is if I wanted to look at like, okay, well, how what is this tool even at all? And Foundry, this is great. I think a great stream where I Google things in front of people. But Foundry has a Windows client, a macOS client, and it runs on Linux. It's built using Node.js, although for my purposes, I don't really care what it's made with, other than that it can run on Linux. And there are actually a number of ways I could have set it up, theoretically. So because it is, and they have some documentation here on, hey, hosting a server with Node.js, Advanced Dungeons and Docker. Yeah, Foundry is one of the first things I messed with on Reclaim Cloud when Reclaim Cloud came out, and I ended up using it there for a little while, and then my DM didn't want to use it. It's not really important, but I got a older version of it working in kind of a hacky way because I didn't really take the time to learn what I was doing. And at that time, I think I posted in the Reclaim community forums D&D of one's own. I'm gonna go with that. But of tabletop of one's own, maybe. But so they have some instructions on how to set this up in Node. And so I could have in Reclaim Cloud set up like a VPS, just like a Linux virtual machine, and just literally followed their instructions here. That would have worked fine. I could have, and that, that would have, I'm not going to go into detail because I didn't end up doing it that way. But if I wanted to do that and go and Reclaim Cloud and make a new environment, I could just go in and, select a Ubuntu VM or CentOS. I'm a little bit more familiar with Ubuntu. And that would have been fine. I also could have used their instructions on like generic install using Node.js. And I could have gone into the environment thing in here and switched this to Node. And that would have required me to basically extract the files that they give me, throw them in the right directory in Jelastic. And that also probably would have worked fine. But I really wanted to do this in Docker. And the reason I wanted to do that is in my pretty limited experience with Docker, Docker makes things very easy to manage the life cycle of an application, longer term upgrades and things like that. So if I had done it the two ways I just described, every time a new version of Foundry would have come out, I would have had to download those files, extract them, and restart the server. Not that bad. It's really not. But there is one little hitch with that with Foundry, and that's Foundry's a paid product. So I actually have to log in to the website to get those files. Again, not the end of the world, but it does mean that it's not something I could like automate in script would be updates. Not easily anyway. So I wanted to use Docker. Docker also usually makes things way, way faster to just get started with in general. So I went to my trusty search engine and searched for Foundry Docker. And I found this community wiki page describing all of the like community members who have got it working in Docker and how they did it. And this is kind of tricky for someone who's not super familiar with Docker, because my experience with Docker has been using Docker Compose, which is very well documented. And basically it amounts to like a file that you make in a certain way and you run a command. The command, Docker will read the file and spin up an environment based on that. Or I've used Reclaim Cloud's tool where you can just give it, you could do the Docker Compose route, or you could give it the route of just giving it a container name and it would spin that up. In my experience, that is really simple and fast to get started with. So I wanted to go that way. So I was looking through these. Some of these are using Docker files where you like define the environment in what happens in it. So basically this is them making their own Docker container. Haven't really messed with that much. Didn't really want to go there. The very first entry on this, aptly called Feldy's Easy One-Step Docker Container, is where I started and ended, by the way. I did look at some other options just to make sure I had a good understanding of what was out there, but this was by far the best documented, seems what most people are using. This is one thing that is tricky about hosting with Docker. And Docker containers for applications, often the maintainer of the application, so in this case, the application is Foundry, sometimes folks will make an official Docker container and they say, hey, like this is the case for Ghost, which we've been working with at Reclaim for a little while now, for the last couple of weeks now. And Ghost has an actual official Docker container. So when you go to install Ghost, they'll be like, you could do it this way, or you could use our Docker container. And that's a pretty good bet that they're going to keep that updated. So that's what I would normally recommend. In this case with Foundry, there is no official Docker container. They're just community members that support it. And so it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. However, this guy, Feldy, or girl, or whoever, I don't know who they are, they may get sick of maintaining it and maybe no one takes it over. And so that's one risk with this. Now, the advantage is this makes it easy to set up for me. And also throughout this process, I've learned where Foundry keeps its files, so it'd be probably really easy to port this over if I ever needed to. But it's one thing to keep in mind if you're looking for a Docker container. Something I've learned in the little bit I've dealt with this stuff already. Jim mentioned, I have found myself falling down the caddy and traffic reverse proxy. Yeah, that was mentioned on the, that was mentioned on this page back here. I barely know I know what those things are for, but I've never really looked at them. And one of the cool things about Reclaim Cloud in general is if you're trying to get a Docker application running in Reclaim Cloud and they mention reverse proxying or traffic management, you probably don't need that stuff, or at least you don't need a third-party solution for that stuff in Reclaim Cloud, because Reclaim Cloud will handle a lot of that. So if you just kind of look for a generic, like, hey, this will get it working. So, yeah, so basically looking through this GitHub that describes sort of, how you do it. This is one of those Docker Compose files I mentioned. We don't need a file like that for what we're doing, but that is one way to do it. I noticed that it has different image tags, which let you define a specific version of the container and therefore Foundry that you want to run. That might be handy if I don't want to update to a newer version of Foundry. It mentions volumes. Volumes, long description, short, in Docker are essentially where your stuff goes. So there's one volume. It's the mount point is /data, and that's configuration data and log storage. Basically, everything I need for Foundry will be in /data on the container. This is important because usually volumes, it's where you keep all your stuff. Everything that's not a volume in Docker, when you ask a container to redeploy or update, it will erase everything outside of that /data volume most of the time, because that's viewed as sort of disposable data, everything outside of there. So all of our Foundry stuff will be in here. It looks like it runs on port 30,000, which kind of stinks because I don't actually want that port. Like, I don't want to have my folks using this container have to go to like my Foundry. This isn't the URL, myfoundry.com/30,000. I want them to just type in myfoundry.com. Again, Jelastic and Reclaim Cloud will actually handle a lot of that for us. Then environment variables. These are really important for working with a Docker container. So we can put these in the interface in Reclaim Cloud to tell it my username and password for Foundry, for instance. We can also, which it will need to download Foundry and do its thing. We can also set a whole bunch of settings using that here, and I have messed with some of them. I'm going to set up one from scratch, and then at the point where I have to put in my username and password for Foundry, I'm never going to show it again, so that you don't know my username and password for Foundry. Again, that's just because this Foundry application is not open source; it's a paid product, and so this container will actually take my username and password and authenticate with the Foundry server and pull a new version of Foundry, which is really handy. That kind of comes back to the auto updating stuff I was getting to. It's going to handle all of that for us. So, okay, so I'm going to try the container out. So, I won't be shy about the fact that this is a cooking show situation. I do have a finished one here that I'll show later, and this is the one I'm actually going to use going forward. But I kind of want to document this process. So, I made a little environment group called demo. You can make these in Reclaim Cloud just by clicking this plus button. So we can work in our demo group. This doesn't do anything for networking. It's just a visual, think of it like a filter or a tag in Reclaim Cloud's interface. So I want to spin up a Docker container. Okay, so I'm going to make a new environment up here. And I can give it a name. We'll call it Foundry-demo. Looks like that name's available. I'm going to hit Docker from this window up here and select an image. Now the image name is Foundry VTT-Docker, but on Docker Hub, you also have like a username it needs, and that I know that it's FELDDY. It's the same thing as the GitHub here, but usually you want to look for a URL pointing to Docker Hub, so you can just confirm that. So yep, it's Foundry VTT. So I'm just going to copy that. And I can hit select image, and I can search Docker Hub for a container that I want. And actually, if I just search for Foundry, there'll be other ones in here too. That's the one we're going to install. If you're doing this the opposite way, so maybe you don't know, you know what application you want, but you haven't done research ahead of time of what Docker container you want to use, you also could search for it here and hit this more details, which will take you out to Docker Hub. And you'll note that in this case, it actually is a complete copy of the GitHub as far as the description on it. So that's fine. We can use that. I will say I have run into situations where the Docker Hub webpage for a container has more or less information than the GitHub. That's most common. A lot of times they don't have the same set. So it's worth checking both places if they list a GitHub or GitLab or some place where you can check the code. Okay, so I click on Foundry here, and I'm just going to hit next for now, and I'll just stay with the cloudlet setup here that they have. We can use a shared load balancer. We don't need an IP for right now. One thing I know I'm going to need right away is those variables that I mentioned. So you can see it actually preloads, it pulls in from Docker Hub some variables it should already know about. So Foundry home, okay, I don't know what that is. We'll leave that there. This is the version that it's going to pull down. That's good. I mentioned already that I'm going to have to put my username and password in, but in this particular case, I'm going to wait to do that. And okay, I can set the admin password. There's a lot of things I can tweak. I could put any of these in it at the time I install this, but you don't actually have to. You can always do that later and then just restart the container. For the purposes of the demo, I'm definitely going to just do that later. And that was my process of figuring this out, is I sort of just deployed the container as is, and then I would use it and find, oh, I really want to change this particular setting. So then I go in and find that in the variables. And so I was able to change it that way. So for now, I'm just not going to do anything in here, but I wanted to point that out because very often you'll want to get to there. Okay, so I'm going to create this. And just doing a single Docker container will take Jelastic probably a minute to pull down the image and map the load balancer to the URL I asked for and all that kind of stuff. So it shouldn't take too long here. But yeah, that's kind of what it's gonna do here while it's in this creating stage. I can actually click on the 2 active tasks here and see more specifics. So it was doing some post install stuff, creating the environment. Okay. Whoops, accidentally maximize that by double clicking on it, but I can minimize this just down here. Okay, great. So it made the container. If I click on this here, I didn't authenticate with my username and password, Foundry. So it may not come up. Also, it's totally normal in any Jelastic environment, not just Docker ones, for it to take a little bit of time to set up for the web application to essentially be ready. I will get into some specifics here, but for Foundry in particular, I found that it took longer than I would deem normal in Jelastic, and I think it's related to the port that it's running on, which was 30,000. Jelastic does some stuff that I'm still reading and learning about, but basically it will try to discover what port an application is listening on or serving content from, and then it will automatically map that to a nicer port like 80 or 40 or 443, which is the normal ports that the web are normally working on. And I found that it took a few minutes for Jelastic to find that every time I restarted. So that was pretty normal. But in this case, I can actually even while it's not up, I can see what the container is doing. So if I go in here and go to log, that'll pop up this little window on the bottom. And you'll notice that bold and italicized the run.log file here. If I click on this, this will actually give me a live view of basically what's happening inside the Docker container. So you can see here a few minutes ago, it would be about 2 minutes ago, it said, hey, I was unable to install because you didn't give me a URL or username or password. Okay, fair enough. So I will have to do that. So in this case, then, I need to go back into my variables. So while I do that, I'm going to switch off my screen share for a second. We are not going to define any other variables today. So I'm going to put those in off camera, and then, yeah, we'll go from there. So let me just switch to my camera here. Oh, I should show here how I'm even doing this. So I showed you how you get to the variables the first time, and you could go back into the environment topology by clicking this little button here at the top level of my environment, and then I could go to variables. That's one way, but a little maybe faster. I guess it's the same amount of clicks. I can also go on the particular application server here, which this is the actual Docker container, and go into variables, and that'll get me right there. So, yeah, so I gotta switch this off for a second. Actually, we'll do it this way. So I can hit add here and then make Foundry underscore username. And that's what they were asking for over in the documentation, I believe. Yep, Foundry underscore username. And Foundry underscore password. And I'll switch my screen share off for a second to actually fill those in with the right values. This is one tricky thing that makes about this demo is normally I wouldn't have to worry about this kind of thing, but because I have an actual login, I have to be careful with that. Okay, so I put the variable in and I hit save, and it actually updates the container right away. I also want to go ahead and restart the container. That way it goes and reads those values. That's particularly important in many cases, but with Foundry, it's important because this container is actually downloading a copy of Foundry every time it starts up. So, but yeah. Well, you know what? I'm gonna have to edit this anyway because I'm realizing that my credentials are on the screen in the run log, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, so Jim, there's your transparency. You're saying sharing my credentials. I guess I did. So this is the tricky thing about this kind of stuff, but whatever. So yeah, I know you were kidding. I just messed up. But if I post this later, I'll just crop that part of the video out. It's fine. Yeah. So now it started back up. And if I go here, it's still not loaded yet. But it should pretty soon. I cleared the history on it so I don't see that again. Yeah, and it will take a bit. I think while I'm waiting for it to turn up, I'll show how I made the restarts faster on the actual environment that I'm using here. So this is the one I'm going to be using longer term. And I found in Jelastic's documentation that if I go into the variables, you can actually set a Jelastic underscore expose variable, and then you can manually tell it, hey, this is the port I want you to forward. So I'll just go look that up here. Yeah, container ports configuration. And again, you don't need to do this. It's just for whatever reason, Foundry takes a minute or two to start up on its own, and then it took another minute or two beyond that for Jelastic to find it. So yeah, I found that here. Switch to the variable section, add the dedicated Jelastic underscore expose parameter, and you can either tell it to not do that if you, for some reason you don't want it to do that, or you can give it the port number right in there, and then that actually does speed up the, by a minute or so, it speeds up the amount of time. And I also flipped around my username and password on accident. This is gonna be great. If I ever actually post the archive of this, I'm gonna have a lot of little editing to do. That's okay. Probably will just crop out some parts of it. Okay. So I'm waiting for it right now to restart here again. Okay, so now it's finally working. Yeah, this is, yeah, it's real, it's gritty. I love it. It is real, it is gritty. I think there's some value in seeing mistakes that people make. At least I find that valuable to be like, either learn from them or commiserate or both. So yeah. So this is that log section I showed before. You can see here, this is actually some text that shows all of the application options is what Foundry calls them, but you can see the port in here that Foundry thinks it's running on. That's great. Server started and listening on port 30,000. So maybe we're ready to go here. Yep, we have life. So, whoops. This is what Foundry looks like then. So I can agree to their terms. And yeah, I've got a web application. It's already got a cert, foundry-demo.us.reclaim.cloud/setup. That's all good. And I mentioned before that there's a lot of different things I can do in the variables that let me, change some options in Foundry. And that's all defined on this Docker Hub page. So one of the things I was kind of hoping to show here is the fact that, like, in my opinion, the usability and getting something up and running in Docker lives and dies on their documentation. So if you find a Docker image, if you're looking to run an application and you're running around looking at different Docker containers, look at the documentation. If there's almost none and the application is somewhat complicated, you may find that it's difficult to use. And so if you're choosing between a couple and you have one that's really well documented, mentions what variables it has available, gives some examples of like either Docker run commands or Docker compose commands. You don't really need those a lot of times in Jelastic, but it's still helpful to see like, oh, they use these variables and this is a common setup. Documentation and examples, all of that, you really want to look for that when you're looking for a good Docker container. If it doesn't have any of that stuff, you may have a hard time figuring out what the creator of that container expects you to do. So this is Foundry. This is Foundry all set up and ready to go. Now with Foundry in particular, I mentioned before that it's going to put all of its stuff in that volume, that Docker volume. So if I go to, well, and that's not a Foundry in particular thing. The particular thing about Foundry is it only has one location. So we only have one volume. So if I go in here into the config, and I'm just clicking on the application servers row here and the little wrench here in Jelastic, and I can kind of pull this window up a little bit more. This will let me browse the structure of the container, the file structure. This blue starred folder here, that's a Docker volume. I mentioned earlier that the volumes are defined, that you can see them when you deploy it. You can also go to the gear icon here and then volumes. That'll show you the same thing. But if you're looking in the file system, you can also see them here. This is where our persistent storage for the container is. So if I open this folder up, I've got, this is where Foundry puts its files. It looks like it makes 3 folders. I'm not super familiar with Foundry, like its data structure. I've worked with it a little bit, but yeah. So I went in here and found, okay, it has a modules, systems, and worlds folder. That's cool because it has a systems thing here. So it looks like I can go and install system. We're playing 5th edition D&D, so I'll install that. Foundry just has a nice little installer for this, so that's really cool. But what I like to show here is that I like to dig into a Docker volume to see what's even there when it first gets created. And then I installed something. And if I go into modules, there's nothing. Systems, D&D 5e. Okay, that makes sense. I just installed a system. There's also a worlds folder. I know you can create worlds, is what Foundry calls them, and that game worlds, and that's what you play in. So you can have multiples of those. And so for my next thing I needed to do is I needed to take a world we were already playing in that was on my DM's computer. They sent me a zip of it, and so I needed to upload it. And this is where I ran into another problem. And this won't be with every Docker container. In fact, in my limited experience, most of them you won't run into this. But this is something that does sometimes happen depending how the container was created. So this particular one, I can easily go through here and, browse files. I can even use this interface here to like upload a zip file if I wanted to. So I could go into worlds and then click this and hit upload. What I'm going to run into is Jelastic has a pretty low limit for how large the file you're uploading can be. I don't remember off the top of my head. I really should have wrote it down because I did look it up. But I had like a 2.5 gig file to upload, and that was beyond Jelastic's limit for letting me use this interface. On top of that, it's a zip file, and I actually needed to unzip the file on the server. So I needed shell access to this. Now, normally in Jelastic, that's super easy to do. You can actually just click, because I'm already in the little config manager here, I can just click on SFTP. And what you would do is you would add your private key. I should make maybe a video, or we might have documentation. I haven't looked on how to do this in Jelastic that's separate, but basically you add your SSH key to Jelastic so that it knows who you are. It knows that your computer has permission to access it. And then you can use an SSH at the command line, or if you're on Windows and you're one of those people that likes to use PuTTY on Windows, you could use PuTTY, I suppose. And you can use an SFTP client like CyberDuck or Transmit or FileZilla. Problem solved. Now, the issue with this container is the way the developer of this Docker container made it is it starts up and then immediately opens Foundry in interactive mode, which means that it's actually like the terminal is doing stuff in the background all the time. That means, because of the way that this Docker container was created, this isn't true of all of them, that I actually can't use the shell of this container at all. Jim's saying that we don't have an SSH private key guide. I'm going to add that to my list of I should do that, because I think that would be a good one to have. So I'll try to remember that, write that down, because that would be a quick one, but it also would be really handy. But I'm not going to cover it in this because I'm going to run out of time. Yeah, so I'm not able to use the shell of this container. In fact, if I click on web SSH right here, it's literally going to give me an error saying the remote server encountered an error and closed the connection. If I go into, say, my terminal, which I've already set up to get into Reclaim Cloud, and I have a little terminal alias so I don't have to remember the whole command. I can go into the demo environment group, Foundry. If I go in here and do it this way, I'm going to get an error as well. It's going to say that I shell error SSH, handshake failed, unable to authenticate. Yeah, it's a really weird thing. Basically, the container is busy and it's just not accepting SSH connections. And again, that's just a result of the way that the person who made this Docker container, the way they did things. Oh, cool. We do have an SSH private key documentation. Support.reclaim.hosting.com. If you type in SSH reclaim cloud, I'd be willing to bet using the SSH gate, external server access via SSH. We might have to mess with the tags and make it better. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is not cloud specific. This is just making an SSH key pair. Yeah, so I will definitely add to my list to include this documentation, but how to make a key pair and then how to use it with Reclaim Cloud, because I think that would be really handy. Anyway, I don't have shell access, which is bad because now I can't upload my huge 2 GB file and unzip it. I have no way of doing that with this current setup. So there are a lot of ways around that problem. I don't. The first one I thought of is, well, maybe instead of doing it this way in Jelastic, I could use the marketplace and install Docker engine from here. And if I search for that, it says automatic installation of a Docker engine CE as a standalone or worker node. I kind of only somewhat know what that means based on that description, but I do know from having used it before that what you're getting is essentially it's a container with CentOS installed on it, kinda. it's Linux. It's a Linux container, and inside there, Docker is already set up. So you can use the Docker run command, or you could use Docker compose. And that's different because you'd be doing stuff via the command line instead of the way we did it here, where we go in and just tell Jelastic to directly run a container. There are a couple things about that, but it is sort of adding a layer. Like, that's not a bad way to go, but it is sort of adding a layer to the entire container experience. It's adding a container between things. So basically, I didn't want to do that because it would have made things a little complicated. Oh, I got my stuff messed up here. Whoops. It would have made things a little complicated. Basically, right now, in the entire setup here, we've got Reclaim Cloud, and I'm obviously simplifying here, but basically we've got Reclaim Cloud, and we're just telling it to directly make a little container, and inside that container, it's running Foundry. And this means because there's less sort of container overhead, there's less layers, it makes it cheaper to run. It also makes it easier to maintain long term. In my experience, it's easier, faster to get set up with. Whereas if I use that Docker Engine marketplace app, which for a lot of more advanced or complicated setups you would need, what you're doing is you're having Reclaim Cloud, and then it makes a container that has Linux installed in there. And then that container of Linux, you're then running Foundry in a container inside that. Again, nothing wrong with that inherently, but it is a little bit more complicated. Yeah, busting out the document camera. I kind of love document cameras, so any chance I can get. But what that means, though, is for things like mapping a domain and the port mapping, it's not super tricky, but it does make it a little more complicated. You have to do things like, in certain cases, use a load balancer. It makes binding a domain a little bit more tricky. Whereas for my use case, I don't need to do any of that because I'm using this top setup. I don't need to mess with that. I can use a shared load balancer, not have to set up anything additional. Whereas with this, I have to figure out, okay, Foundry is going to be talking on port 30,000 here out to Linux, and then I need to have that go out to the greater internet or the web. Again, not that hard. We have some examples on blogs and documentation of doing different applications that way. Just found I didn't want to go that route in this case because this Foundry container I found was so simple. So I just didn't want to get with that. All I needed was a way to get into the interface, get some shell access to download or upload some files and unzip some stuff. So I abandoned that pretty quickly because I realized it wasn't exactly what I wanted. So, sorry, I just changed around my Stream Deck buttons and I'm getting all used to it yet, but all right. So what I did from there is I did some reading about the storage containers. And basically Jelastic lets you add a separate container to your stack for additional storage if you want it. By default, a container gets, well, you can actually set how much you want it to have, but in this case, 50 gigs, that's actually a lot for a Docker container. I could take that and mark it down, but there's not really any benefit. You're only getting charged for what you're using, so I just left it at the default. But I could go to the environment topology here for my Foundry demo and click on storage. And if I go here, there's a thing just called extra storage. And I looked up what that was, and it was like, hey, we're going to make another Linux container that has storage attached to it. Cool. And based on the documentation I read, hey, it is a Linux container, so you can SSH into that. And that's great because I can run my Docker container that I can't SSH into over here, and I can use my storage container over here, and then I can map the storage to the data volume in Docker. So basically I can use that storage container as my shell access as well as storage. And it only takes up one cloudlet. It's not expensive. So if I enable that here, and I'm going to kind of do that again because I sort of glossed over that. So I'm going to cancel. So Foundry-demo, click on my environment topology, storage, extra storage. I really don't know what the version numbers here. I had to look at what that even is about, but I just picked the newest one and next. And then I can actually go into my volumes. And remember that I said this is with a persistent Docker storage is called volumes. And right now it says local path data, local file system. That means the local to the container. So in that application server, Foundry VTT, it's a little bit grayed out right now, but it's saying, hey, the volume is there and we'll keep it there. Cool. But I can go in and edit this. And then instead of being local file system, I can change it to data container, which is what I just made. And I can change this drop down here. Oh, I just realized I didn't apply my changes. I have to make the container first. So I have to go back and apply the changes on the data container. So I'm storing the world's 2.5 gig of file on the storage and mapping the connection. Yes. Yeah. So what I'm getting to here is I mapped the data container to the Docker volume and I uploaded my world there. And I'll show the end result of that. Actually, you know what? I'll just do that right now while it's making some configuration changes. But I will have to start that environment. Yeah, I don't want to do that because Docker has that. Foundry has that limitation of me only owning one license at the moment. Okay, so cool. So I have that created. Now I need to map the storage. I could go back into my environment topology and then volumes, or I could also just click on application servers and then this gear and then volumes. Same thing. So if I click on this, instead of being in the local file system, I'll change this to data container. And now you'll see it says NFS server, extra storage. Sweet. You can also map these across environments. I don't know why you do that, but you could. Technically, you could do something like have like a huge environment that's just storage and it's on all the time. I think that gets into some more advanced sysadmin-y stuff than I think most people are going to need in Reclaim Cloud, but you could do that. All right, so I'm going to hit extra storage, and it says remote path. So I could map it to a remote path, but keep in mind that extra storage, it is also a container. So it also has volumes, just like this other Docker container does. So what I just did is I clicked the drop down and it had a predefined data volume in there as well. So I just was like, great, I'll use that one. So all I did is just selected that volume, data. I don't want it to be read-only. I do want the container to be able to write changes. And then I hit apply. And then I'll have to restart things after it applies here. I should have shown that the storage container had a volume, but you can check it out the same way I was showing earlier in the application server, where you can go to this and volumes. Same thing over here. If I go to click on the cog here and then volumes, you can see that it has a data volume as well. It's storing it locally on the container. But when I go over to the Foundry one and click on volumes, it has a data volume and it's stored on extra storage, which is this container over here, in its data volume. So basically I hooked the two volumes up together. Now, while I can't use SSH in the container, I can go to the storage container, click the little SSH thing, and I'll get logged in right here. And that works really well. I can also use, and I can find that, by the way, the path, if I looked at here, the volumes, volume/data. So I can just go to /data in this container and that'll work. Now I do need to restart here because I applied these changes, but I didn't have Foundry restart. But once I do that, Foundry should start putting its stuff in that new place. So if I restart that here and it comes up, I should be able to see it as it starts up, create the folders we were working in before. It made like a data folder, a config folder. I think in data it had like worlds and stuff like that. So I can check that out here in a second as it starts up. I'm going to look at the logs here again, which again contain my password. So I'm going to switch away from that, from you all seeing that for a second. Yeah, so it looks like the server has started based on the logs I'm seeing. So let me switch back. So because the server started, I believe we should be able to know. Let me look here in config. Okay, so what's up with that? Oh, I didn't actually change that directory. Wow. Okay. Amazing. So if I change that directory, there we go. There's my Foundry stuff right in here. And I can go into the data folder, I should be able to in systems find 5e, which I had installed. Oh, it's not there because I deleted, I remapped everything. So if I go to game systems, I probably would have to uninstall it and then I can reinstall it. But I will say that once I figured that out, I did that first. But yeah, I can go in here and reinstall the application. I also was able to then go and use my SFTP client. I use Transmit to upload that big zip file. And once I had done that, I unzipped it on the server. I was all hunky-dory from there. So I kind of wanted to sort of document my process of, hitting my head against certain things and how I kind of worked through it, what things I like to look for when picking Docker containers, and then also kind of mention this storage mapping thing because that was just super handy for me to use in this case. It is so much easier for me to manage Foundry as just a container running right in Reclaim Cloud than inside a container inside of a container, in my opinion. If you're someone who's really familiar with Docker already and is comfortable with the Docker Compose stuff, then that may not be easier for you, and you may prefer to run it inside of a Linux container. Then you can use the command line tools that you want to use. But I think there's a lot of advantages to this way, and especially in terms of like network configuration, like I mentioned before. So I am pretty much out of time, but yeah, that's my stream. Um, I think I am gonna, when I get a chance tomorrow, probably cut up this part, eliminate the parts where my password is shown in plain text on the internet, and then I will probably upload this, and maybe someone will find it useful. Maybe they want to run Foundry, or maybe they just want to learn a little bit about Docker. Yeah, so Jim says, what is the reason I could not use SSH in the Foundry Docker container? Just part of the design. Yeah, it's part of the design of the person that makes that Docker container, not Foundry, but this Feldy person. It's just how their container works. As soon as Foundry starts, SSH no longer works in the container, and Foundry starts as soon as you start the container. So effectively, you never can SSH into it. I don't know why someone would make it that way. I suspect it's sort of an oversight. And my guess is like, and I'm trying to think of a good example here, but like, let me zoom out here a second and show my whole desktop. So for instance, like if I was to run, like if I was to ping something, yeah, let me just ping reclaimhosting.com. And it's going to keep going. I can't remember if this is the case with ping on Mac OS, but I believe it's just going to keep going indefinitely because I didn't give any other arguments. Because it's running, because my terminal is running an application and it's sort of taken over. I can't type anything in here and it's going to listen to me. You can see that I can type, but it just kind of keeps on going. I can't do anything until I interrupt ping. I can do that with Control C. But that is quitting ping. It's done now. So it will no longer be running. And then that gets me back to my terminal. I think what's happening is essentially, and this is a big guess, but I think what's essentially happening is this container, when it starts up, runs like Foundry.js or whatever. I don't know much about Node applications. It's essentially running that script, and it's taken over the terminal. Whereas a lot of Docker containers would run that and then immediately background that application so that you could use the shell. They haven't done that. There might even be a way where I could get this Docker container to work the way I want. It does have some configuration options that let me do things like run a special script after the container starts up that I define. I don't know. But in my case, it's much easier. Instead of hacking on the container, it's much easier for me to just have a separate place for things to get stored, especially in this case where the entire environment only takes up 2 cloudlets. So we're talking about an additional cost of $2 a month. So I think this will, let me go in my environment topology here. All said, I'm in $5.70 a month. If I only had one cloudlet, it'd be about $250, $260, $270 a month. So it would be half the cost, but in either case, it's not costing too much. So again, that's my guess as to exactly why it works that particular way with the whole with the non-interactive shell, but I could be wrong. And someone that knows more about Docker may know more. All right, well, I gotta run and get on some support tickets for the afternoon. So oh wait, no, I don't. It's Wednesday. What do I think? This is a great stream. Is me looking at my calendar. Yeah, I don't. I'm mixed up. I was thinking it was Thursday. Well, but in either case, I think I'm pretty much done showing what I had planned to. I guess with that in mind, with time, I'm going to actually shut down this demo container environment for now. And I'm going to start up my real one just to kind of show the finished product. I guess if someone stumbles on this looking to learn a little bit about Foundry, I won't do a lot other than just kind of start it up. But yeah, it's a pretty cool application. Right now I have this at foundry.us.reclaim.cloud. Starts up really quick once I put in that Jelastic expose variable I mentioned earlier. Probably have to I probably have to give Foundry a little bit more time, though. I think Foundry itself is still starting. Patience. Never patient enough with this stuff. So it looks like it started up, but I'm not sure why it's not working. I think it's a browser like caching issue, just because I was using Foundry in a different spot. So if I do a incognito window, maybe, yeah, okay, that works. So it's definitely just a browser cache kind of deal. There we go. Okay. So if I log in, I have my admin key and 1Password. But yeah, so here's just sort of like a demo world. And I can go in here and log in as the DM. And this is what a virtual tabletop looks like. You have, this is again the DM's version of this. But ooh, I got some broken images and stuff. I have to check that out later. But basically, yeah, this is a bad demo with all the broken images. But basically, you have different scenes and layouts, and there are characters on there, and you can move the characters around. And in addition to that, you can roll dice right in this interface, so people can know that you're not cheating when you say you rolled a 20. So I can put in like roll 1d20, and it rolls a dice here. It looks like 14. Yeah, this is love to see this on the mighty Reclaim Cloud. Yeah, I will say this runs so much faster than what I'm used to with Foundry, because typically Foundry is the way we had been using it is whoever was the DM just opened ports on their home network, and we were connecting directly to their home network, and the upload speeds are terrible for most people at home. So it would take like this operation where I went in and joined the game, and once I hit join here, this load right here would often take 30, 45, 50 seconds. And Foundry even has tools to like preload things. So basically you can say like, oh, load all the images from this scene. The scenes are the purple boxes for people ahead of time. You kind of just don't have to mess with any of that when it's on the cloud, because it gets served up so much faster than normal. So I'm really curious as to why my images aren't working. I will have to look at that. I must have messed up something when I uploaded the world. But let me go in here and change this, go to this other world here. Oh, this is the same one. It also could be still my browser caching situation. I don't know what's up with that. And the particular browser I'm using right now, it doesn't. Usually, you can just hold Shift when you do a refresh, and that will make things work properly. But it doesn't always work with this one for some reason. Okay, so this is a little bit different setup, but here I can kind of show. So like in this case, I will import this scene. So basically you can have different maps, and they which are just big images, and characters can move around on the virtual game board. So you can see here, this is like a whole city, and you can have players say like, oh, I want to go check out what the heck's the Dragon's Tooth, so they can move their characters around and stuff like that. So that's kind of what this is, how this works. And there's other scenes. If I probably some like generic like battle maps where you can have characters in combat and all kinds of stuff like that. Not going to go into it, but that's what this thing is, and it works. So, but thanks for hanging out, and hopefully this was valuable. I know it was valuable, at least to me, to document what I did. So I definitely will have to edit this and put this up someplace so I can save it for next time I do something like this. All right, that's going to be the end of the stream. Thank you.